Welcome back to Plugged In. I'm Phil Lombard,
And I'm Yinka Argundi.
and we'll be your hosts for today. Today we have Sid Subramani. Sid is a principal in our Hatch Advisory group and is a battery lead in Hatch Advisory. This involves helping clients across the value chain from mining raw materials down to recycling. He's currently based out of Santiago and has primarily worked in the lithium space. Good morning, Sid.
Hi guys, thank you for having me on. Very excited to be on here.
So jumping right into it, we see a lot of activity in the news about gigafactory announcements in North America. Is there an equal amount of action going on for the upstream raw materials in order to supply that?
I'd say there isn't an equal amount. We're seeing an increased amount over the last year and a half to 2 years in North America. But North America on its own won't be able to supply 100% of its raw material needs for the downstream gigafactories, just given the lack of mineral endowments in North America across a variety of these critical metals. So any solution for North America or even Europe for that chance will have to be a global response where you'd have lithium from South America, Australia, and nickel from around the world that could then get processed into the specialty chemicals, the PCAM and CAM that you need in North America.
Thanks for those insights, Sid. In a historically slow-to-move industry, do you see any shifts in the approach mining companies are taking to get supply online as soon as possible?
So I think in the context of that, you've got to understand why they're historically slow to move, and I think maybe labeling them as that could be seen as in a negative light. But mining is a very risky and capital-intensive business, and there's multiple cycles, and it can be cyclical. So as such, when a company thinks of investing in a mine expansion or a greenfield mine, there's a certain level of risk that they have to take on that downstream producers in the, let's say, in the chemical space, in the PCAM midstream, or downstream producers in the gigafactory space don't necessarily have to take. But that being said, we are seeing some developments and some changes where miners are responding to some of their new customers, namely being the OEMs and end users, where they are fast-tracking some projects and sharing that risk or taking a calculated risk for some sort of development of a mine. Namely, that's a bit easier sometimes to do in the lithium space than it is in the nickel space. One of the issues that we have typically always discussed is the development timelines in the mining space are much longer than they are downstream in the PCAM, CAM, and the gigafactory space, where the changes can be in the order of 3 to 5 times. A mine could take anywhere from 5 to 10 years to get developed once a body is discovered, whereas in the PCAM, CAM, and the gigafactories space, these assets can take anywhere from 2 to maybe 3 years. That gap is quite significant, and the industry is slowly responding to that difference. What we'll eventually see, and what we are seeing, is as end users sort of come to face the reality of this lack of the raw material supply, we'll see them essentially backward integrate and get more of a stake to nudge those projects along, and eventually see them take on a bit more risk and share some of that risk with the miners and end users. The other aspect that we're seeing that can potentially change and incentivize some of these miners to speed up some of the development are the incentives that we've seen within the IRA. The IRA was passed a few months ago, and of course it was seen as a landmark legislation to help support a North American supply chain. There are some very bold targets that are likely going to be unachievable in the short term, just to put it bluntly, but lofty targets for miners as well as end users to localize much of the supply chain. And so where the mineral endowment is local, I think we will see some sort of movement and advancement in that area. However, in North America and in Europe, we do see many challenges that the mining industry has traditionally faced still to persist. Those being community engagement, and some of the environmental aspects and permitting aspects associated with getting some of these large projects off the ground. So I would say, to summarize, the mining industry is reacting to their customers' needs, but they will need support, and we're slowly seeing support from the government, but of course regulatory agencies and the communities and those of us who are going to be driving these EVs will have to come to the realities that if we want to drive an EV, we need to potentially have mining in our backyard as well, and need to get comfortable around mining in our backyard.
Fascinating insights there. Thanks, Sid. Just looking at some of the raw materials deficits we're seeing, not just locally, but globally, how do you see these raw material deficits impacting industry trends?
That's a great question. Um, so I think the raw material deficits are going to persist and really come to head, I'd say, in 2025, 2026 timeframe, when a lot of the EVs are supposed to, or I would say the OEMs have most of their growth projections really kick into second and third gear. We see at the moment that there is enough material to satisfy demand this year and next year, of course, at a given price. Going forward, however, I think what we will see is a combination of let's say demand delays and adjustments, as well as some additional supply coming online. What we've seen and what we are going to be seeing, and I think this is clear in lithium, of course, is previously uneconomic deposits and previously viewed assets that were discarded as, let's say, tier 2, tier 3, or even tier 4, will suddenly make sense and be economic to provide that, to try and bridge them that gap. These could be micas and clays in the lithium space. Recently we saw announcements by Imeris that they're planning on entering the European market with a significant investment for an asset that could have been challenged under the previous price regime, where let's say 3-4 years ago, anything north of $15,000 per ton of lithium hydroxide was viewed as a significant advantage. However, now when you're looking at prices at $70,000 to $75,000 a ton, those assets suddenly can meaningfully contribute to that supply. On the now on the nickel side, I think OEMs will realize that at least for the short and medium term, they will have no choice but to go to Indonesia, and as they do that, they will be able to provide some of the best practices and exercise some improvements in some of the practices in Indonesia. That, of course, will take some time in order for it to play out. It isn't something that will happen overnight, but if we do want EVs that will require nickel, the place where most of it would come out of would be, or a good chunk would come out of it fairly quickly, would be Indonesia. And we're sort of seeing that at the moment. Now, the IRA does complicate things because a lot of that nickel is being developed by Chinese parties, but I suspect that the OEMs will essentially try and balance the risk of not complying with the IRA with not having enough nickel to have their EVs. Now, additionally, we'll also see a move towards, let's say, LFP chemistries that do away with nickel and do away with cobalt, and focus more on lithium. And we're seeing that in North America. We're seeing that in Europe. In North America, at least, Tesla was the first to commit to it globally. We saw Ford also announce some plans to enter the LFP market. So I think the industry will respond in a variety of ways to solve the demand side, and I think the miners as well will respond in a variety of ways from a supply standpoint.
Thanks, Sid. So you mentioned the different developments being made by automakers in North America, but how do you see that impacting the global market, considering the level of development being made by the Chinese counterparts?
So China has, I think everybody recognizes that they've got a significant
head start, decades or multi-decade head start in certain areas over the rest of the world. And this is not just in PCAM, but also in some of the raw materials, including lithium. They've been very, very aggressive in going after lithium mines in Africa, lithium projects in Argentina, and also getting into some mines and JVs in Canada and in Australia. So, but they started doing this over 10 years ago. So they had the vision to be able to see the importance that lithium was going to have to their internal needs. Yes, they were looking for their internal requirements for a local market versus looking at, let's say, being the primary driver versus looking at an export market. And that's something where the Western OEMs sort of need to try and replicate. OEMs need to start taking some more risk. As I mentioned early on, mining is a riskier business. They need to start taking on that risk in asset development, very similar to how the Chinese suppliers have managed to do over the last 10 years. And they need to do that very quickly. We've seen some OEMs announce deals, and that's all very important. But we need to see a lot more of that, and we need to see that done a lot more quicker than it's been at the moment.
And do you think the boom in lithium projects will play into the cyclical nature often seen after high prices spark large numbers of projects to come online?
Well, yes, I think commodities and cyclicality just go hand in hand. But one thing it's very important to understand that lithium is not a major cost in the batteries for EVs. It's of course a cost, but it's more of an enabling technology. So even at today's prices, while they're quite high, the overall impact is there on the batteries, but more importantly, it isn't the most significant driver, even after a 5-6-fold increase in the price of lithium.
In the interim, while we wait for North American projects to ramp up and meet the supply gap, how do you see recycling playing into this market?
So recycling will really get into earnest in let's say the latter half of the 30s of the next decade, and take up providing significant volumes in the 2040s. It'll probably provide a good percentage of lithium to the overall market, in the range of 5 to 15%, maybe 10% of the market can be supplied by recycling. But it won't help a lot in the long term if the desired conversion rate of IC to EV is maintained. It's really dependent on having enough EVs out there in order to have those batteries come off, and in order to be able to recycle those end of life batteries. The longer that transition takes, the longer recycling will take to become a significant contributor to the supply chain.
Taking this a step further, when we look at the different projects being announced, we sort of see a pattern of vertical integration across the EV value chain in different regions. How do you see this impacting pricing?
So one thing that I do see happening is as OEMs or end users start vertical integration, we'll see, and going down to the mines, as they consolidate mine to PCAM, we'll see a stabilization of prices. And so what we can expect in the interim, definitely in the short and medium term, is a lot more volatility, definitely in the lithium space. But as I mentioned, that volatility on the lithium side will likely have a higher floor than it has in the past. And so I guess we are in a new price regime, but you can expect a lot more volatility to remain until that vertical integration is complete, or is done to a significant amount where it sort of subdues that volatility.
Thanks, Sid. So we talked about Hatch's services to clients in the lithium and the battery space. Could you share some snippets about how our services have evolved in this space over time?
Sure. So Hatch has been a leader in the lithium space. We've done, I'd say, over 70 studies for a variety of different types of projects over the last 15 years as projects have developed, whether they be in hard rock in Australia or brines in Argentina, or more recently, some of the direct lithium extraction technologies. I would say Hatch is a leader in the lithium space. And our team out of Brisbane, Mississauga, and Santiago have really cemented their name in the industry as technical leaders from a process standpoint, from a development, design, engineering, and execution standpoint. I think one of the landmark projects that we worked on very early on was a lithium refinery.
That Galaxy project was built in China in 2011, and when Hatch built it, I think it was a capital intensity of in the range of $7,000 to $8,000 a ton. We've seen capital intensity triple since then. Probably in the next decade, especially in this inflationary environment, that could even increase beyond that. We have a swathe of projects coming online over the next 2-3 years, so we'll see what that looks like. We're obviously constructing projects in Western Australia at the moment, but a lot of the projects that are that are about to commence construction over the next 2-3 years will give us a good indication of what the new capital intensity looks like for some of these large converters.
Thank you for coming to this episode of the podcast, Sid. We appreciate your insights on the supply constraints facing the battery market.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me on. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you to our listeners. Please like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.